Are you looking for the best budget GPUs? In this video we will look at some of the 5 best budget GPUs on the market. Before we get started with our video, we have included links in the description, so make sure you check those out to see which one is in your budget range. Number 1. AMD Radeon RX 6700. The RX 6700 is the black sheep of the RX 6000 series. It came out only in 2022, much later than most other RX 6000 cards, and pretty much wasn't marketed at all. It also sits somewhat awkwardly between the RX 6650 XT and the RX 6700 XT, which cost around $250 and $330, respectively. What makes the 6700 intriguing, however, is when it's closer to the $300 mark or less, making it at times a better deal than the 6650 XT, and a great choice for anyone wanting to game at a higher frame rate at 1080p or even 1440p. The 6700 slots in right between the 6650 XT and 6700 XT with 36 CUs, 80 MB of Infinity Cache, and 10 GB of VRAM. One quirk of the 6700 spec sheet is its relatively low clock speed, about 200 to 300 MHz lower than the 6650 XT and 6700 XT. But since all of these cards are based on the same silicon, the 6700 should have some room for overclocking, which means even higher performance. And speaking of performance, the 6700 is about 10% faster than the 6650 XT and about 90% as fast as the 6700, which isn't surprising based on the spec sheet. The niche for the 6700 comes in when you look at the price. Some models are going for $300 or less, which is about the same price the 6650 XT goes for. The 6700 has more VRAM, is faster out of the box, and can run even faster with an overclock, so it's not only better for hitting a high frame rate at 1080p and 1440p, but also just a better deal in general. Meanwhile, the RX 7600 as AMD's latest mid-range card goes for $270 like some 6700s, but has 2 GB less VRAM and is generally slower, making it an objectively worse choice. That's all assuming you can find a 6700 at that magical $300 price point or less though. The problem is that there aren't a ton of 6700 models around, and many of them are actually going out of stock. At the time of writing, XFX's Speedster SWFD 309 is available at major retailers and for just $270 or $280, but it's hard to imagine that lasting for long. If you want the best value for $300, get in while you can. Number 2. Asus Dual GeForce RTX 4060. NVIDIA has been more or less absent from the budget market since 2020, and not much has changed since then, as the RTX 3050 never went for the $250 NVIDIA said it should cost, instead retailing for closer to $350 for most of its life. If we stretch the definition of budget to $300, then NVIDIA's acceptable RTX 4060 is certainly a good candidate, and while it won't amaze you, it's certainly a usable graphics card with good efficiency, performance, and features. With just 3072 CUDA cores, 8 GB of GDDR6 VRAM, and a 128-bit memory bus, the RTX 4060 is pretty barebones compared to the card it apparently replaces, the 3060, which had 3584 cores and 12 GB of VRAM on a 192-bit bus. Despite all that, the 4060 coasts along on its massive 2460 MHz boost clock, allowing it to actually be faster than the 3060 by around 15%, though having just 8 GB of RAM is a little concerning. As for the competition, it's mostly just the RX 6650 XT and ARC A750, both of which are about on par or at worst a little slower depending on the game. In theory, AMD launched its RX 7600 as a competing card too, and while it is $30 cheaper and just as fast, the 6650 XT's current price of roughly $250 makes the 7600 redundant. Beyond pure performance though, the 4060 offers DLSS, better ray tracing performance, higher efficiency, and some other, more minor NVIDIA features, all of which can certainly justify spending the extra $50 this card costs. While it would be nice for NVIDIA to launch another GPU in the $100 to $200 segment like it had up until the RTX 30 series, it's highly likely the RTX 4060 will be NVIDIA's cheapest GPU worth getting for some time. The RTX 4050 is based on the same silicon as the 4060, which probably means it'll be at least $200, and who knows if it'll be fast enough to be worth getting. At least with the 4060 you get an acceptable product, even if it's not exactly a budget GPU. Number 3. Intel Arc A750 Limited Edition. Intel's first attempt at consumer-dedicated graphics in 2 decades focused purely on the more budget-conscious area of the market. The Arc A750 isn't as cheap as some GPUs, but at around $250 or even less since it seems to be on permanent sale, it's affordable enough to give any budget system some serious horsepower. It's roughly equal to the RTX 4060 and RX 6650 XT in performance and features, though inconsistent performance from driver issues means it's not always the best GPU at this price point, though it often is. Performance-wise, it isn't too far off from the flagship Arc A770, having 28 of the A770's 32 cores, though it is limited to 8 GB of VRAM as opposed to the A770's potential 16 GB. In the wider context, the A750 performs at a similar level to NVIDIA's RTX 3060 and AMD's RX 6650 XT with a much more attractive price-to-performance ratio. One other thing to note is that if your motherboard doesn't support resizable bar or rebar, you should avoid Intel Arc Alchemist GPUs as they require this feature to be enabled to achieve good performance. Besides performance and ray tracing, the A750 boasts DisplayPort 2.0, something not even the RTX 4090 has, and HDMI 2.1. Additionally, it was one of the first cards to launch with a hardware AV1 encoder, making it perfect for content creators who want to be on the bleeding edge. There are some issues with older games, particularly those relying on DX9 since there is no hardware support. But newer technologies like DX12 and Vulkan see great performance on the A750. And with 8 GB of VRAM, it's better spec than some of its alternatives. While driver issues plagued Intel's Arc GPUs when they first launched, Intel has been hard at work resolving bugs, glitches, and performance issues. I'm much more comfortable giving a thumbs up to the A750 now that it can provide a more reliable and consistent gaming experience. The A750's price cuts have allowed it to continue to be competitive against the RX 6600 and 6650 XT even though both of those cards are much cheaper than they used to be. Number 4. AMD Radeon RX 6600. The AMD Radeon RX 6600 is essentially a cut-down RX 6650 XT. Fundamentally, there aren't any huge differences between these two GPUs, but the 6600 can be found in the $200 to $250 range, which makes it more accessible to budget buyers while having a better bang for your buck if you can find this card at the lower end of the price spectrum. Generally, you'll find that the 6650 XT is about 20% faster than the regular 6600, and this is down to the 6600's 28 CUs as opposed to the 6650 XT's 32, a lower core clock speed, and slower VRAM. While there's nothing you can do about the lower core count, you could try overclocking a 6600 to get performance close to a stock 6650 XT. Compared to the RTX 3050, the 6600 is about 30% faster, though loses to the slightly more expensive A750. Features do help the 6600 compete with NVIDIA's and Intel's cards. FSR is a good alternative to both DLSS and CSS and is present in almost as many games as DLSS. The 6600 also has features that would be appealing to streamers, such as AMD noise suppression for filtering out non-vocal noises from your microphone and AMD's latest encoder, which is almost as good as NVIDIA's. The one thing that prevents us from recommending the 6600 as the best budget GPU from AMD is its inconsistent price and availability. You can find it for as little as $200, but there are very few models in stock at the time of writing. The 6600 XT and 6650 XT can be found for around $250, which puts the 6600 uncomfortably close to GPUs with far more performance. But if you can find a 6600 in stock at that $200 price point or a little higher, it's a deal you should take. Number 5. AMD Radeon RX 6650 XT. AMD's Radeon RX 6650 XT gets my recommendation for the best GPU in the entire budget market thanks to its good bang for buck and overall performance. It's not firmly in budget territory at $250-ish, but it's ideal for users who want a good mid-range GPU that can game at 1080p and 1440p. It's also a generally better choice over NVIDIA and Intel's competing cards around the same price and performance. With 32 compute units or CUs, the 6650 XT is a slightly cut-down version of the RX 6700 XT and 6750 XT, which both offer 40 CUs. Additionally, the 6650 XT has 8 GB of GDDR6 as opposed to the 12 GB found on the 6750 XT and 6700 XT and the 10 GB on the 6700. However, the 6650 XT is also roughly $50 cheaper than these higher-end models, which helps it just barely squeeze into the budget class of graphics cards. The 6650 XT's main performance-based competition is the RTX 4060, which usually goes for $300. The 4060 does come with 8 GB of GDDR6 like the 6600 XT, but does have an advantage with DLSS, superior ray tracing performance, and other NVIDIA features, though not every user will find all that stuff useful. Intel's Arc A750 is also a competitor at $250 or less, but suffers from driver issues, and you might also consider the newer RX 7600, but in almost every respect it's effectively a carbon copy of the 6650 XT but for a little more. Originally, I recommended the RX 6600 XT, which the 6650 XT theoretically replaced in 2022. The 6650 XT never made a ton of sense as a purchase since its performance boost was paired with a price increase, but nowadays, the 6650 XT has better availability and costs about the same as the 6600 XT. If you find a 6600 XT for a much cheaper price than the 6650 XT, however, get the 6600 XT instead. If you can't find either a 6650 XT or 6600 XT, then get the 7600, which will have good availability for the foreseeable future.